let me transition because we've got two great workshops. So I'm going to introduce the leader from EdCast of this next workshop, somebody I've enjoyed working with, and he heads up Global Service Delivery, Vice President Global Service Delivery at EdCast. Let me hand things over to you, Greg Luckock. Greg, are you there?
I am. I need to share my screen if I could there, Phil.
Great. I'll stop sharing and hand it to you.
Okay. Fantastic. Thank you, Phil, very much for passing the baton. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Greg Luckock. I am the Vice President of Global Service Delivery here at EdCast. And I'd like to begin our session just by saying thank you. Thank you for attending our 2021 Future Work Summit. I really do hope we can do this next year live. But this has been a fantastic event. I have learned so much over the last couple of days listening to these amazing speakers. And as a career learning professional, it just is always exciting to me when we can get together as a community, to share and learn from each other, even if it's virtual. Our session today is going to focus on the execution side of learning strategy. We're going to be talking about learning implementation and adoption. So we are going to get tactical here, right? And I'm really excited to have today joining me two amazing EdCast partners and summit sponsors, Tier 1 Rapid LD and Pluralsight. Do make sure you stop by their booths after our sessions today in the virtual exhibit hall and share your virtual business cards with them and your perspectives on this topic later today. First, we're going to hear from Tier 1 Rapid LD as Jim Everidge will share his thoughts on preparing for and managing through some of the change implications of a learning experience platform implementation. And then we're going to be talking to his colleague, Dr. Mark Zoller, who will also be sharing some deployment best practices that will help get you to a successful project launch. We'll then turn our attention to the adoption side, where we'll have Jordan Morrow of Pluralsight share his roadmap for successful learning adoption. So to get the session started, I'd like to go ahead and kick it over to Jim and Mark to get some brief introductions and get their perspectives on learning implementation best practices. Jim?
Greg, thank you for the introduction and getting us started here. My name is Jim Everidge. I'm with Tier 1 Rapid LD. I've got with me Dr. Mark Zolar, who heads our performance and learning practice. And we've been a EdCast partner for many years. Actually, we attended the second annual Future of Work conference back in 2016, I believe it was. There were about 35 people in attendance. If I understand correctly, there were about 3,000 people that registered for this conference. So a pretty big leap over that period of time, fairly short period of time. And I think it mirrors really what is going on in the learning experience industry from the perspective that there's a lot of growth, there's a lot of interest, and people are beginning to recognize the value proposition that learning experience provides. It was interesting in attending that conference back in 2016. We had been in the business of implementing learning systems for about 17 years at that point, primarily learning management products and similar things. And we had begun to see kind of the cracks in the wall where utilization was going down. There was a general dissatisfaction about learning management systems and how they were not really engaging the learners. And so it was really an early peak, because in 2016, the learning experience segment was fairly nascent. Not many people knew about it. Not many people understood it. And so seeing how that has grown and evolved. And now I think that the general corporate learning and development professional sees what I saw back in 2016, that learning management no longer is engaging people in development. And, how do they make a change? So that brings us really, Greg, if you go to the next slide here, it really brings us forward to, what does it take to make these work? Now that everybody recognizes that there's a place for it, how do you make it work? And I think that one of the biggest things that you have to recognize is that there's a fairly substantial change process. that's involved in getting people to use these platforms. And if I look at, how do we make change work? I think the place to start is with the platform itself. And what are the differences between learning experience platforms and learning management systems? A couple of things I'll bring up here. One is that, it's really learner directed, and meaning that people express interest, they select the content that they want, they select the channels and the journeys, the pathways that they want. So they're really making the decision about what it is that they learn. And that's different if you think about from a traditional learning management where they are pushing content to users. I think the next biggest thing, and one that EdCast has done a great job with, is putting learning in the flow of work. So embedding the EdCast application into Office applications, and I'll share that with you in just a minute, but really allows the user to learn while they're working. They don't have to stop working to go to learning and stop learning to go back to work. They can learn while they work, and that's a big change. A lot of the content that they're consuming is career driven. So they are pursuing not only their current job, but what are their future jobs. Content that's relevant. We're going to talk about the different forms of content in a second, but or how EdCast brings it to the user. But being able to give people content today that's relevant to their job right now is far different than the traditional model of building content, over a 4, 6, 8 month period of time and finally getting it in the system. You don't really get relevant content. So making it relevant makes them more engaged. The whole social component, communities of interest, is a big part of the success of these platforms as people get together and learn from each other. And then lastly, curated content. So we're able to put content into the learning pathways that these people are working through and do it on a real-time basis. The machine can do it, a person can do it, or both, but curated content is really important. So when you look at, those are a lot of substantial differences. And so it's important that you prepare your audience for this type of change. Now, one of the things I mentioned is learning in the flow of work, and EdCast has over 20 out-of-the-box business application integrations. Common applications that you'd be familiar with: Slack, Microsoft Teams and Office, Salesforce, Chrome, Facebook Workplace. So there are many more. And really what we're talking about is someone seeing a word or a phrase or a concept in work while they're in an application, while they're in Salesforce, while they're in Microsoft Office, and they want to learn more about it right then, they can do that. So simply pulling up EdCast at that point gives them the ability to EdCast will pre-search, or they can do additional searches and find content relevant to them at that moment in time. And that's a big leap. The other thing is these platforms are really all about content. And EdCast does a great job at aggregating content from lots of different sources, allowing people to curate that content or the machine to curate it, creating content or creating connections between content that haven't been made before, targeting content and guiding content. So it's all about content. And when you make the content available to a user, and they really don't have to go to 4 or 5 different systems to log in to see all that content. They can get it all in one place. That's very powerful. Back in 2016, I think the average Fortune 100 organization had over 30 platforms of learning where people would go to get content. Not everybody goes to all 30, but it's still a lot of different places to go. And when you can put all of that in one application and make it accessible and make it relevant, because remember, the engine is still indexing all of this content and making it relevant to the user, that's super powerful. Greg, what about the next slide? So when we think about implementing change, we have a pretty standard change playbook. It really isn't any different than doing a learning experience project. Is no different than doing a change transformation around leadership or strategy or other things. But one of the things we do think about is keeping the learner at the center of the process. So thinking about what it is that they're going through and then facilitating the change around that. The place that we start is the narrative. What is EdCast all about? What is it going to do for them? How is it going to impact their job? How is it going to impact their performance? So we want to change the narrative about what learning is, because they're typically coming from an environment where learning is all about compliance. And I've got to check off these 6 compliance boxes by the end of November, or I get, reported to my manager. So we want to change the narrative that learning is something that's more of an everyday occurrence and not something that is something done periodically. In our change work, we create messages by audience. We create a baseline communication plan, and then we create kind of elements. We expand on elements at specific touch points. We call these moments that matter. And it's really those points in time where people will be thinking about learning, and we want to emphasize what the opportunity is using a platform like EdCast. And then we have a lot of different kind of rollout protocols that we work with. And what I mean is, it's usually not just implementing the platform and going live. We've got a customer that we're doing what's called a preview. So we've configured the system. It's ready for production. We're going to give a preview for several weeks to a small audience of people and get some feedback. And then we're going to make some changes to our change initiative. So we do some realignment after that preview, and then we do a pilot. And we make some changes after the pilot. Then we do a MVP rollout, so just the minimum viable platform for a larger group of people. And then we do, maybe a segmented rollout to a different business group or a different functional group within the organization. And so every opportunity, then we continue to make some realignment with the change plan. And once you've now done a lot of this change process and you've implemented the platform, there's a fabulous opportunity to measure that. You can measure things like knowledge sharing, how much people are contributing user-generated content to the system. One of the things you'd like to see is a reduced content search. You want the engine to bring the content to the people. You don't want them having to go find it or not find it, as the case may be, often in searching through an LMS. Reducing the content repository. One of the things that EdCast is particularly good at is referencing content that's outside of the system. And what that allows you to do is to let someone else maintain how current that content is, as opposed to you pulling it in and you having to maintain that. As I mentioned earlier, there's this concept of you're going from a push environment where you're predefining everything for people to a pull environment where the users are doing that. So measure that. One of the other things you can measure is this whole concept of collaboration, mentoring, and coaching. So how much of that social interaction are you seeing in the platform? You probably didn't have any before in your LMS. Now you can measure how much you're getting out of it. On-demand access. One of the things I mentioned a minute ago is this concept of making learning a daily habit. You can measure that. They went to the LMS 4 times in a month. They went to EdCast 20 times in a month. 20 times is a daily habit. And so I think that's an important thing that you can measure. And then obviously integration of disparate content resources reduces the friction of people having to go find the right content at the right moment in time. So that's how we feel about change. It's super important about and how EdCast is implemented and the success of the platform. Now, Dr. Mark Zolar is going to talk a little bit more about some implementation hurdles, considerations, and some big ideas that he has around implementing learning experience platforms. Mark?
And Mark, if I can get you to do that in about 8 minutes, that would be fantastic.
8 minutes. You got it. Thank you. Thank you, Greg. And no, absolutely. Thank you, Greg. And thank you, Jim. It's great to be with everyone today. So as Jim mentioned, wanted to just cover a few, first, what we call some big rocks, implementation hurdles that hopefully you can avoid, have a smooth implementation and deployment. The first one is really even before you get started. So we work with organizations a lot on these implementations. And, one thing you find is this is typically a long process. So there's been a lot of decision-making and anticipation and planning before even the selection of an actual platform and its implementation. So as such, there's often a date that an organization is already working against. And to the extent that you can anticipate the impact of and the typical duration of a contracting process on that schedule, it's really quite helpful. So if it's possible to build in a buffer and ensure that all the activities that are related to that process in terms of registering a new vendor, if the platform provider's new, all the InfoSec activities that need to occur, the last thing you really want is a protracted contracting process to really start to pinch your implementation schedule before it even starts. So if we look at application and content integration, these are really naturally fundamental to the success of a platform. And the work can be complicated and a little bit thorny at times. So with respect to getting your key applications integrated, such as your HRIS and your LMS and any other internal applications that will need to interface with the LXP, it's important to involve those internal stakeholders early in that planning process, pre-implementation, and apprise your implementation team of your typical internal processes, the timelines, the workflow, because those will vary by organization. So to the extent that a typical integration with your HRIS takes X amount of time, it's important to call that out and make sure it's considered in the schedule. Similarly, with your content sources, apprising your content partners of the upcoming integration, reviewing and making decisions about what content and data will be important to pull over, vetting that with your implementation team as early in the process as possible will save you a lot of time. With respect to your customer team, your internal team that'll work on this implementation, naturally key to the success. Identifying those key members from the various work streams and stakeholder groups within the organization, securing their participation early, ensuring they're able to participate in all of the onboarding and training activities, which are typically front-loaded to the early part of the implementation process. That is extremely useful, ensuring that you move into the core of the implementation activities smoothly, which includes making all of your configuration decisions in the platform. So ensuring that you're consistently documenting those as you go, to the extent that internal conversations and interim or foundational decisions need to be made that affect those, getting those discussions facilitated quickly and effectively will really help you move from configuration into the curation and testing work and ensuring you've got plenty of time to do that. So some other common and key considerations as you go through this process, lining out and defining your core learning use cases. What learning problems are you trying to solve by implementing the LXP? Frequently, these are identified and defined during the RFP stage. Hopefully they are. If they're not, or they need to be refined, it's important to do that early, as they will make that previous bullet on configuration decisions much easier. Jim alluded to pilot programs where we think those are critically important to test your use cases prior to a wider rollout, allow for an appropriate review and revision cycle so that you can make meaningful changes before you may roll out to your enterprise. Thinking about a phased release schedule, we know that LXPs are increasingly feature rich. However, it's not necessarily necessary or desirable to make every feature and functionality available all at once. So by progressively releasing a phased implementation plan, you're allowing learners to gain comfort and familiarity and form new habits in chunks. So it's good learning. It's good. It's a good change process as well to grow that level of comfort. The web and mobile consumption expectations is an important consideration as well. Particularly when we do the work implementing, we're typically doing that in kind of the web format. But understanding how much mobile versus web uptake you expect will help you to be sure that you're configuring and making design decisions that optimize the experience for both of those. And then finally, thinking a little bit about user-generated content. So one of the great opportunities with LXPs is that peer-to-peer sharing. However, organizations really need to think about processes and policies that they need in place to approve, review, in some cases restrict those contributions from their learners. And finally, important to just make sure you've planned appropriately for post-launch support as you scale up and make the platform available to a wide audience. So Greg, let's move on to the next slide, and I'll just quickly cover a few things to think about as you go post-launch and think a little bit into your maintenance and future state. So there are a lot of staff development opportunities. You've got you may have an internal learning and development team, seasoned, running and building programs for many years, yet we know that this is a new paradigm. So it's an opportunity to think about what new skill development is available and desirable for that internal team to support a modern learning approach. Related to that is the opportunity to look at content development models that are particularly effective for learning experience. Many of those models you may have seen that focus on design thinking and human-centered designs are particularly effective in this area. Thinking about how to make the most of the capabilities of the platform, not just in providing that curated, personalized experience, but designing those intentional learning experiences, which sometimes are not quite optimized or maybe a little bit overlooked in favor of that personalized self-directed experience. The targeted nature of LXPs allows for really a lot of rich and useful information around content consumption and preferences. And that's a great opportunity to look at the data from your LXP users to help you make decisions more broadly about your curriculum and content. Along that same lines are the great opportunities driven through XAPI for measurement and evaluation. So there's really a lot of new opportunities around analytics and how you might evaluate learning effectiveness and seek ways to tie data coming out of LXP back to your core KPIs that you track for your organization. With respect to talent and skills taxonomies, more and more organizations are looking at how can we tie this great learning experience to the career frameworks and talent frameworks that exist within the organization, and defining and integrating skills taxonomies are a great way to do that and tie those two pieces together. And finally, be sure to think about LXP specifically as you consider your governance model and a sustainment plan that will make sure that as you continue to build a user base for your LXP, you're harnessing all of that data and results to make strategic decisions about the future of the LXP within your larger ecosystem. So that's just a number of things that we think, if you keep in mind, will help you not only to get off to a good start, but be thinking strategically about how to grow the LXP as part of your overall strategy.
Thanks, Mark. I really appreciate it. Great stuff. We are going to move now into our next section, but our Tier 1 Rapid LD partners have been fantastic to work with. They apply these best practices on engagements for us on a regular basis. They really know their stuff. So again, try to swing by their booth, have a chat with them after our sessions today. We're going to turn our attention now to learning adoption best practices, and I'm really excited to be joined by Jordan Morrow from Pluralsight. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, Jordan, to introduce yourself and to talk about your learning adoption best practices as well.
Fabulous. Thank you so much. And hopefully you can hear me okay. And I might look a little bit different than the picture you see on there, just because I just don't like having hair. People say what happened or things like that. And I don't like having it, so I got rid of it. But thank you for the opportunity to share some thoughts today. My name is Jordan Morrow, and I work for Pluralsight as their head of data design and management skills. Basically, what that means is I'm a big nerd. I own all the learning content that comes into play on our learning on the Pluralsight platform, all around learning around data. And I've been at this with Pluralsight for 10 months, but I've been working with organizations for years now and helping them adopt and build data learning strategies. And over those years, I've found trends and things to keep in mind that allow us to get stickiness, as I like to call it, or adoption to actually occur. Some of the organizations that I've had the opportunity to work with are BMW, Disney, Nike, even the United Nations, in helping them to build out ways that you can get individuals and organizations to fully succeed in learning practices. We're living in a time which was even accelerated more by the COVID pandemic, where upskilling and or reskilling is necessary for workforces. And so if you want to go to the next slide, what I want to talk about today is how do we actually drive a roadmap so that when individuals are given learning in front of them, it allows us to build out a strategic way for them to actually succeed. I love some of the things that were just shared where we talk about measurement. Are we actually measuring how learning happens? Are we watching this to occur correctly? I do love, and I love that it was just mentioned, analytics and data-driven learning. How do we actually use data and analytics to make this happen? So for me, I'm going to go through each slide. We'll hopefully have about 1 or 2 examples where we've made this happen. So the first one I want to talk about is when we're trying to get adoption of a learning strategy, whatever that may be. And I will go off of my personal experience with data, but this can actually span across any type of learning that you're trying to implement in an organization. First and foremost, does the organization, one, know the actual outcome of what you're trying to achieve? So this goes back to the measurement, right? Do we have a starting point, point A, and do we have an endpoint, point Z, of what is our targeted goal? A prime example of this is I was meeting with a very large financial insurance company here in the United States, and they were walking me through this whole data literacy learning strategy. Now, my background is I helped invent and pioneer that field of data literacy. So they brought me on board, this is a few months ago, to take a look at this massive learning strategy that was in place that they were excited about. And I brought it back and I said, okay, I can see that you've built this learning out there. Tell me, what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve as a business when it comes to data? Can you tell me that? And then they'd walk me through things and I brought them back around again. And I said, I need to know what is the outcome that you're trying to achieve. This went back and forth about 4 times. And on the 4th time, the learning group finally said to me, I think we need to know what the outcome of what we're trying to achieve is. And I said, yes, when you know what that outcome is in the beginning, and we know that the outcome can change, we need to have flexibility. But when we put that in place of what our desired state is at the end, then the learning paths fall into place. Then the personas of the people that we want to teach fall into place. This makes it so much easier to build a plan that the users then know what they're trying to accomplish. That sets the tone, that sets the why for everything that you're trying to do throughout it. Nope, you're good. As we set the why, we set the stage for success, right? How many learners like to get an email that says, you have mandatory training? I can tell you right now, they don't like getting that email. But if we can say, let's show you what we're trying to accomplish. This is the outcome of what we're trying to do. And here is why we're trying to do that. The learner can then relate in their mind what they're trying to do. It makes it easier to then go to them and allow them to learn. Next slide, Greg. So the second thing is once you know an outcome of what you're trying to do, we can set the strategy. We can actually put in place what is the strategic learning path that we want to put into place here. So another example that I'll use is an organization, a large one called Lockheed Martin, which a lot of people know. Lockheed Martin had 111,000 employees. And I started to meet with their group to talk about how do we implement a data literacy learning strategy at this organization and get people to actually adopt all this learning. So we set the tone at the beginning and said, the thing we want to do is we want to create about an army of about 150 data literacy evangelists within Lockheed Martin. So we knew what the outcome was. Then we started to get tone and put things into place on the strategy. With that strategy in place, we decided, okay, we're going to do cohort learning. That cohort learning would be involved with about 30 people every month for 5 months to allow us to put this into place. When we put that strategy in place, we then had almost this hand selection of the people that we would put into each cohort. Now, this was done on two-way basis. We allowed for volunteers to come into play, and we allowed for assignment by people because these were data professionals within the organization. When we did that, that strategy allowed us to map out a strong learning path. Now, one of the things that was shared right before me was the measurement side of this. I'm a data guy. That's my background. So for me, measurement is key. Measurement allows us to put things in place. When we measure, what we would do is in that strategy, we would assess each of the learner at the beginning, and then we would assess them or can assess them later. Do we have measurable growth? And then in the middle of that, we could do surveys and different things that gave us a data-driven learning approach. Through that data-driven learning approach, it allowed us to modify the strategy over the 6-month period. What this did, as each cohort went through, it allowed us to integrate and communicate with them and say, okay, this is working, this is not working, this is engaging for them, this is not engaging for them, and you can modify throughout. One of the final things that we did throughout this strategy to ensure stickiness is we held weekly office hours with the data expert. What that did is as these employees were going through data learning and through the adoption process of this learning strategy, it gave them the ability to speak with an expert on a continual basis. What that allowed them to do was make sure they were engaged. So every week we held these office hours. We saw great participation. We saw participation in our learning model, and we saw an upskilling. Now, the question can then become, how many hours a week were we putting these learners through? And it was only about 1 to 4, right? People have busy jobs already. And the moment that they hear they're going to be put through some learning strategy or some upskilling or reskilling, if they think that they're going to be spending 8 hours a week, 16 hours a week, and they've already got a 40-hour job, it's going to deflate them a little bit. And so what we did is we put the strategy in place after knowing the outcome of what we wanted to do. And we said 1 to 4 hours a week alone for these learners. That made it easier for them to engage and be a part of the process without feeling overwhelmed. And I think that is an absolute key, is when we're upskilling, reskilling, putting these learning plans into place, if we flood them with too much, especially with how busy and weird times that we still live in with COVID, we don't want to overwhelm them. So an upskilling, reskilling initiative, for it to stick, that stickiness that we're talking about, needs to be done with a strategy that says, how do we not flood them too much while at the same time giving them enough information that the skills we need them to develop can happen? Next slide. So as part of the learning adoption, there are two different things, and we'll go to the next bullet point on the next one. There are two different types of learning that take place, especially let's use my example from a data perspective. There are absolutely two different types of learning that have to take place. Now, the question came to me, I was meeting with the city of Austin, Texas. So this was the municipality of Austin. And as I was in a meeting with them, the question came to me, what do you invest in first? Do you invest in people or do you invest in tools? And as that was the first time that question came to me, now this is years ago at this point, just showing my age. When that question came to me, what do you think people answer that to be? Well, of course, they answer it to be, you of course invest in people first. Well, yes, but you need to hold off on that a little bit. Because if all you do is invest in people, well, then are they ever going to be able to use the tools? And if all you ever invest in is tools, will the people be able to use those tools? It has to be a symbiotic marriage, if you will, between the people and the tool. So then this becomes almost this integrated learning approach, right? And I love that we were hearing micro-learning services, pop-up learning, and those different things. So we have to teach people how to use the tools that they have been given to succeed in their jobs. That is one of two skills gaps that I'll mention as we go through this. The skills gap to how to properly use tools. So let's use data as an example. Data influences and so many tools infiltrate every single job and every single area of business today. You can hear Tableau, Microsoft Excel, databases, the cloud. All these things are overwhelming. In fact, I helped participate in a study that showed individuals get overwhelmed by the amount of tools and data they are being asked to use, to the point, now this was a joint partnership study with Accenture, to the point that employees will forcefully not use the tools they have been given, instead going back to old ways of doing things, and they will take days away from work. It was around 42 hours on average per employee of work missed from this feeling of being overwhelmed from the tools we are flooding them with. So if we need and want adoption to be successful, we have to understand that the tools we are giving them, we need to train them on them, but train them properly. We need to close the skills gap on all the tools that we give them so that they don't feel overwhelmed, so that they don't feel all of these things hitting at them at once. And so part of this learning adoption is, depending on the skill, if you're trying to teach someone proper communication, if we're trying to teach someone how to use data, analytics, whatever it may be, based on some of the comments we've heard, or if we're trying to teach people how to measure and use KPIs properly, at the same time, teach them how to use the tools effectively to make decisions throughout it. Next slide. So the next skills gap that we're looking at is the soft skills gap, right? So the tools represent the technical gap. Whenever a learning strategy goes into place, especially from a technical perspective, there will be soft skills that need to be mirrored together that allow us to teach individuals how to apply whatever they're learning. Two examples of this is yesterday I was talking to a friend who went and had an experience and all these ideas had popped into her head. And I told her, okay, I need you to do two things when you get home. The first thing is I need you to write down every single idea that you had. The second thing is I want you to put a bullet point next to it that says, how will I do something about this idea? Or how can I apply this idea? When we think about the skills gap that exists across different industries and everything, when we upskill and reskill, a lot of times we think of technical things that we need to do. Rightfully so, those things need to happen. But at the same time, there needs to be a combination with the soft skills that will bring that to light. The second example I want to use is 2 Fridays ago, I had the opportunity to be a guest lecturer at Columbia University in their Masters of Statistics program. And what was very interesting about that was to get the students to be successful when they graduate that master's program, they brought me in to not teach anything about statistics. It was purely how to communicate in the field of data and analytics, in the field of statistics. Why? Because I can tell you right now, as an executive in that field, if I'm looking to hire someone, I can look at the degree that they possess and know that they learned the technical know-how that they need. The upskilling, the reskilling, and the adoption that I need to really bring that to life is the soft skills. Do they have communication, project management, leadership, and those different things? So if you want stickiness in the adoption of your learning program, find whatever you're putting into place and combine it with soft skills. Combine it with things that will get outcomes from the learning and make the students, make the learner figure out how to apply it. Just like my friend yesterday. This is your idea. What are you going to do about it? Next slide. So the final thing I will say, and this is whether you are a leader or not a leader. And this one, I'm going to add one end point to it. Own everything that you do from an adoption, from an extreme ownership perspective. There's a great book on that by Jocko Willink, if you haven't read it, called Extreme Ownership. But basically, own everything about the learner. Own everything, every aspect, right? If you are putting people through a learning program, own it. If you are here as an individual contributor, own your learning path. Now, one of the questions that comes up very often is, what is the biggest roadblock for data and analytics success? What is the biggest roadblock for data and analytical learning? It has nothing to do with tools. It has nothing to do with the learning. It boils down to the culture of the organization. If the culture of the organization is not ready to adopt, then change management needs to take place. Now, when I define culture, we're talking about the traditions, the way of doing things, the experience, the skill levels, and are people ready for whatever learning path you are putting into place? If they are ready for the learning path that you are putting into place, then you will find stickiness is going to fall into place. If they are not, then that learning is not going to stick. The adoption is not going to happen. If you have 100 people, maybe you get 20 people taking courses. If the culture is ready, if there is excitement about it, then you make it happen. As leaders, one of the things that I always start off with learning paths and programs around data learning is communication plans and basically thought leadership webinars. Before we send out any sort of training for the learners to go through, we start off with, here's a communication of why we are doing this, what is going to happen, and then how will it happen. Then I will put people through, depending on the organization, if they want it, through almost a series of a webinar, almost like a TED Talk around Why are we doing this and why does this matter? Now, that might seem daunting, but the reality is with today's technology, you could do a Zoom recording and then just share it out and keep it in a library. That's one of the things we did on the strategy with Lockheed Martin is we recorded every single office hour to create a library of office hours for learners to go through. That way they could reference back to it and come back to it. As you can see, all of this is about adoption at a whole scale level. Each individual is going to be different. To make that happen through the strategy and everything that is going through here, what we allow this to do is that strategy, that library, this holistic approach allows an organization to adopt and adapt according to what they have. It's not a one size fits all. You'll find when I build learning roadmaps for companies, I have a backbone that I follow. I have this skeleton framework that I follow, but then I go in and we map it out accordingly. Then we work and we go through the things that I've discussed to make sure that we can get it into place. So next slide. So with that, my time is coming short. I'd say thank you to EdCast and for the people presenting before me and the wonderful thoughts that they had for the opportunity to be here. But connect with me. I do this for a living. I put data learning strategies into place, and I appreciate the chance to share a few minutes with you today.
And Pluralsight, really appreciate Jim and Mark and Jordan and the great things you guys are doing. Thanks for being partners of ours.